Well, good morning, and this is week 3, and we've called this Waking Up to the Noble Journey. So this is week 3 of our conversation, and as we did last week, we'll review a little bit of where we left off on week 2. We did some more conversations around the inquiry of quantum spirituality, that we're living in a time where we're trying to let go of a we might call it Newtonian worldview, and there's also another phrase in there that we might be familiar with, a dualistic worldview. That's one of the side effects of living in the Newtonian world, where you start thinking in either-or concepts. So we further explored that last week, and our work really was then to say, what is it that we are awakening to? What are we opening ourselves to as we do this work? Not only are we thinking it through, but we're also trying to develop a way for this to be embodied in our lives. So we had a wonderful breathing practice, and I think we'll do more of that again this week. A wonderful breathing practice of presence, and opening ourselves. And then not just presence, but opening ourselves to the practice of imagination, and collecting ourselves in that space, recognizing that the imagination is another word for manifestation, or maybe it's a pathway to manifestation. Becoming partners in what we might be living into in creativity and in creation. In that same conversation, then we talked about this idea of reality, and that reality is not static, but reality is always moving, and reality is deeply, deeply relational. So we talked about this relational real, which I think we talked about that meaning that that keeps us from floating around in this swimming reality without any kind of tethering, without any kind of connectedness, that there is this deeply relational life that we're living. We talked a bit about iconography and idolatry, and how living this way is similar to what we talk about when we talk about icons. That we don't look at an icon and create an idol out of it. We look through it into a deeper reality, and that's the journey that we're taking. And so when we see an icon that way, we're not only seeing the icons that might be written to be hung on a wall, but perhaps we might see life that way, see life as iconically, rather than idolatry. So we might be looking at one another and seeing through one another into the great mystery, and seeing through life into the great mysteries. How am I doing, Don? Am I okay?
That's
Give me
good.
a sign. Give me a sign. I'm much more, by the way, as you can tell, kinetic in the way I talk, so I'm just making sure I'm in a good place.
Yeah, so we're going to continue to talk about tools for the imagination, and we've talked about imagination being the subtle faculty of consciousness. So usually we think of consciousness as just our awareness, and in mysticism people talk about, well, we're going to raise our consciousness to a higher level, we're going to experience a different state of consciousness. So that raises the question, okay, that's great, you're in this different state of consciousness, now what are you going to do? And so imagination is a faculty to actively participate in what unfolds in different states of our consciousness, which are not in different places from where we live. It's our awareness. We talked about in the first class that we tend to live in a simulation, a very limited projection of reality, and so we can learn to live in a much fuller experience of reality. So I mentioned last time Hasranite Khan talking about spirituality and awakening is about becoming a natural human being, and I mentioned there's just this fine turn of awareness that can enable us to shift into a whole different way of being. So that sounds very simple, and in one level it is very simple, but another level it takes a lot of practice. And why does it take a lot of practice? Because we are so conditioned and habituated to returning to our usual frame of reference, which, as Jonathan mentioned, is dualistic, is separated. We're also conditioned to, even when we have a wonderful experience, awe-inspiring experience, we're present to it for a little bit, but then our very human tendency is to pull back from that and to have a commentary in our mind. This is really great. This is wonderful. This reminds me of, this is like, and we're no longer in that experience. We're in the reading about it in the newspaper. I have an online subscription to the Caller, the local newspaper, so I was looking at the 5-day, or actually 7-day forecast, and somebody there wasn't paying attention because they put a forecast when there wasn't going to be a cold front coming. It was like 80s and 70s next week, going, no, this is not right. So if I thought this was real, but it wasn't refreshed to correspond to actually what's going on. So this is very important to keep in mind. It takes practice, it takes availing yourself of many, many techniques which have been developed by different traditions for working with consciousness to be able to, first of all, be able to experience subtle aspects of our consciousness. The Sufis talk about subtle organs of perception, and you can read a book about it, you can listen to me talking about it, but there's no way that that's going to do the trick. And I was telling Jonathan, I was reminded when I was in my psychology practice, I went to an advanced hypnosis workshop for therapists by a psychologist who used hypnosis in his practice. And so he related a story of a client that he had that said, Doc, I want you to hypnotize me so that when I play the piano, I'm going to sound just like a concert pianist. And the psychologist said, do you know how to play the piano? And he said, no. He said, well, okay, I'll hypnotize you so that when you play the piano to you, it'll sound like a great concert pianist. But to everyone else, it's just going to be noise. So this is so important. We want to do it quick. We want to read a description, okay, this is what it is, and so it's just enough to know about it. No, that's just keeping yourself even more stuck in the stimulation if you think that's going to do it. So it's very important to practice different things. Last time we did some very simple breathing practices, but I hope those of you that were here or listened to the recording later experience something different from that. We're going to do another practice in just a little bit. So these practices are designed to give us a taste of ways of different experiences of our consciousness using imagination. We used imagination with the breathing practices. I said, imagine a river, imagine the blue sky, imagine a mountain, and so on. Well, let's try one now. So the mystics say that there are different realms of consciousness called by different names. Subtle realms, subtle planes, spheres, and different religious traditions. The different heavens. Different traditions have different numbers of heavens. The Sufis in various traditions have 3, 5, 7, 14 different subtle realms. And this is really analogous to the visible spectrum, seeing light that comes through a prism. And we're so used to going, well, there's 7 colors. No, there's millions and millions of different colors. We've just named 7 chunks of this by these colors, but they could be broken down in many different ways. The same is true with subtle aspects of consciousness. So one of the ones we're going to have a little taste of now is the Angelic Realm, which is certainly present in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and Buddhist traditions have different deities and so on. So there's different casts of characters that inhabit this realm depending on the tradition, but it'll be enough for our purposes. In the Sufis, they say that the angelic realm is a realm in which the light, unlike the light in the physical realm, which is from a point source, like from a light bulb or a candle, comes from a point and radiates out. The light in the angelic realm is all-pervading. It doesn't come from any place, it comes from everywhere. It's an all-pervading light. It's a different quality of light. Okay? So we're going to use our imagination as the tool to help us be able to begin to experience what this light is like and the impact that it has on our being, the circulation of light between different realms. So we're going to do a motion of the head, which the Sufis call the motion of the zikr. Zikr means remembrance, Z-I-K-R or D-H-I-K-R. So put your head towards your left shoulder, move it downward. You're going to make 3/4 of a circle, right shoulder, and then looking up. So let's try that again. Just start left shoulder, downwards, right shoulder, and up. So that's the first part of the motion. The second part of the motion is to imagine that there's a beam of light that comes from your third eye down to your solar plexus, and as the head comes down, you're imagining that you're bringing this light so it pierces into the solar plexus and it enters your body through the solar plexus. And then the head comes back up. Okay, so the concentration that goes with this. There is something called the aura, which we've all heard about. Some psychics or sensitives can actually perceive the aura. I think I mentioned last time there's actually machines now that can measure these subtle frequencies of light, and it corresponds exactly to what the psychics see. Like they'll say, well, the machine is saying there's a blue light coming from this part of the body and red from here, and so on. So this is a real thing. It's not just mumbo jumbo. So we all have an aura, and it's not necessary to be able to see it. And here comes the value of imagination. And someone's not more advanced if they can perceive the aura than someone who can't. People are just wired differently. So imagine now as the head goes in the 3/4 of a circle, you're just surveying your aura. So imagine you can perceive your aura, the subtle light that surrounds your body. Comes back up. And as your head goes upwards, imagine now you're tapping into the light of the angelic realm. So now you're in this realm of beautiful, uncreated light, which has a very different feel and energy about it, innocence and purity and beauty. And now as the head goes down to the solar plexus, imagine you have a beam of this angelic light that's being infused into your solar plexus, and it charges your whole aura with this light of the angelic realm. It's being infused with this different kind of light. And then the head comes back up, and you're just feeling that. Okay, now we're going to repeat this practice, but here's the kicker. Each time you do this, you're surveying your aura after you brought the angelic light into it. Well, your aura is not the same as it was the last time. It's been supercharged by this angelic light. And as the head goes back up, the angelic light that you're tapping into is not the same as it was before, because there's what the Sufis call, and in other traditions call, the returning light. The light that returns to the subtle realms from your being that's been changed by how it's been interacted with by the uniqueness of you. So now you've infused the angelic realm with the light of your being, and it's made that light even richer than it was before. Okay, y'all with me so far? Your aura's been infused by this light, and it's been changed. Each time you do it, you're bringing this newly changed, enriched light into your aura as the head goes down, and your aura is even more charged by it. And now as your head goes up, the next time it goes back up, this angelic light has been changed. So it's continuing, the light on both ends has been enhanced by the previous repetition. So it's not a repetition of the same. And so we're just using our imagination. Again, you don't have to see anything. You don't necessarily have to feel, well, I don't feel these rushes of energy going. It doesn't make a bit of difference. It's enough just to have the intention. So let's do this a bit. And you don't have to worry about breathing here. So just slowly survey your aura. The light goes in the 3/4 of a circle. Left shoulder down, right shoulder up. Tune into the angelic realm. Head goes down. Imagine this angelic ray of light from the third eye to the solar plexus. And the head comes back up, and you're just feeling this effect. And then repeat at your own rate. Let's just do this sometimes at your own rate. Slowly is good. Okay, and then just relax. And notice how you feel hopefully you can sense a shift. And so we're going to be wanting to put this into words, and it's like this or that. And that's okay, but just feel it without necessarily trying to conceptualize it. And also notice how the atmosphere in the whole room has changed. See if you can sense that. It's very different than it was before, because there's the collective effect of all of us doing this practice together. And this is such a simple little practice, and just a little bit of imagination with this simple motion is enough to change things. Excuse me. I talked previously about the research of William Tiller with subtle energy, who has demonstrated by many experiments that when subtle energy is brought into what he calls ordinary reality, it opens up new possibilities that were not there before. Well, guess what? What we just did is having that impact on each of you, but it's also having that impact on the whole environment.
Well, it's I'm often asked what being in a religious community, or because I'm a priest, I'm also about what's being in church about, like what's that about, and what are we doing here? And that's not an uncommon question to ask at a place like All Saints, which has a kind of a tradition and a mindfulness of being open to ask that kind of question. But it's not an unusual question to receive when I meet people who are disconnected or deconnected from religious communities or religious traditions. And one of the ways that I've tried to talk about it recently, more so, but I've been talking about it for some time, is this idea that we are a community of practice. That really, when it comes down to it, there's very little about the path that is expressed in the Christian tradition, and by that I might say the ancient tradition of Christianity, that is about belief systems, but it is more about practice systems. One of the ways we know this, and I think we might have said this last week, is that in the teachings of the New Testament, but also then in many of the teachings, not all, but many of the teachings of Paul, in the letters of Paul, he's much more interested in how people are practicing with one another. It sounds often like he's giving, either he, Jesus, or he, Paul, is giving, naughty things, do this, don't do that. But really what is going on is not saying a bunch of rules. What he's saying is that these are vital practices in the midst of a community or a shared life together that desperately needs an alternative way of living. And I think that's what I hear as we've talked about this, as you and I have talked about this, is that this is less about fixating on the practices as being doctrinal. I'm going to say more about that in just a second, but more about practices that shape a human community to be an alternative community within what we might call the illusion, or within what we might call the illusory space that we're living in. This false experience that we might be having, or what did we call it at the very beginning?
The simulation.
The simulation, yeah. We're living in the midst of the simulation. Interrupting that simulation pattern requires creating an alternative practice. And I love what you said, Don, about the light rays. Scientifically, that is exactly, I think that's a deep, deep truth that we probably just skipped right over in our high school and maybe a little bit of college biology, that the only reason we see what we see is because we have the receptors, because of the receptors we have, not because of what it is, right? So the only reason we're seeing what we're seeing is because of the receptors we have in our mind and in our brain, in our eyes and in our brain, not because that's what really is around us. So just hold on to that for a second. Okay, there's more going on around us right now in this room in the electromagnetic spectrum, the visible light, the light spectrum, we might call it, than we are seeing, not because of our moral deficiency or because of any kind of thing, but because our receptors are tuned for a certain bandwidth of light and a certain kind of interpretation. And we know this because science is telling us that there are all kinds of creatures that can see much, much, much more than what's going on. Incredible different wavelengths, and can hear much more. So then what we tend to do as human beings is universalize our experience as being all of the experience that there is, which is, I think, natural. But what we might want to open ourselves to, as we're trying to do, is that all that we're experiencing is not all that there is. There is infinitely much more, and maybe we can tune our receptors to be subtly able to receive a little bit more information.
I've got something that just inspired me to think about. So, receptors are more than just the physical receptors in our eyes and our ears and tactile senses and so on. You could say that our receptors are our conceptions of reality. And so those take in input and process in a way that's usually consistent with our previous understanding and programming. So I'd like to talk a little bit about holograms and how they work. So a hologram is made by shining a light on an object, and then it creates an interference pattern. But then there's another light, which is called the reference frequency, which isn't shined on that, and those two lights come together and they create the pattern of the hologram. And so now when you put back in the reference frequency, you see the original object the way that it is. Okay, so we could say that we're continually recreating what we perceive and think of as reality by the light that comes in, the input from the senses and our concepts about it, but it's only interacting with what's been stored in our own experience. It's not really a living presence interacting with what we're experiencing. However, if we can come to a relational way of living our lives and experiencing now, there, just like we did with this simple practice of the angelic realm, there's an interaction between the light that we receive and the light that's emitted from us. And now both of those lights are changing both sides. So now instead of a restoration of some previous concepts that we've had, there's some new emergence of what takes place that could only happen through that way of beingness. Mm-hmm. So when we can be in a state of, you could say, living relational presence that's continually emergent, what we experience is always changing, it's always refreshed, it's always, the Sufis say, there's a new creation born at every instant, and it's possible for us to live in that, and that world is so much richer than the world that we usually live in and don't realize that we're living in this very constricted world that we collectively created and don't know that there's any difference to. And back to it takes a lot of practice and training to be able to do this. It takes developing very simple skills that are not exciting, like concentrating. One of the basic practices that's done in the Sufis, and I'm sure other traditions, we can try this for just a minute. Close your eyes and imagine you're sitting in a movie theater and there's just a big white screen in front of you. And now imagine that there's a red square in the middle of the screen. So picture that. Now try to hold that square still and just hold that. We'll do this for 30 seconds. Okay, so how successful were you just keeping that square just it's very challenging. It's hard to do it for 5 seconds, much less 30 seconds. And we talk about, oh, that kid only has an attention span of 30 seconds. Well, if we're honest with ourselves, ours is probably more like 5 seconds that we really
on a very good day
hold something. And so that there's a ancient book by Patanjali called How to Know God. It's a beautiful little book. And he talks about practices in there, and I forget what the term is, but when you can hold definitely communal consciousness with an object for 1 minute, and I'll talk about this very high state of consciousness you'll be in. 1 minute, well, it's going to take you quite a while before you can get to that. The point I'm making is some of the basic skills, like I play clarinet, and for years I've worked on scales and arpeggios and exercises before I could get really good at it. You know, I couldn't just start out playing wonderful improvised melodies. We have to learn the basic skills, and we also have to trust that we have this inherent faculty of imagination that we can do just the most wonderful, amazing things with. And actually, it's the tool by which the Sufis say that we can fulfill our divine purpose for existence. Well, that's a pretty good reason for developing imagination. But it isn't going to come by just reading about it in a book or coming to a class. Hopefully, what Jonathan and I are sharing here will whet your appetite, which I think is true of any worthwhile teaching. It'll whet your appetite to do your own exploring and develop your own capacities.
One of the funny things about the way in which we live in formalized religious communities that I'm familiar with is that we have been, I'm tempted to say, oh man, I wish we had those practices. It's really cool. And the disappointing thing is that we do, but we don't call them that. And if we would, because they began as practices. So there's the story of Jesus sitting down with friends at a meal. And he participates in exactly what we're talking about, an imaginal exercise. He's at the end of a meal, and he's probably at his wit's end, and his disciples are at their wit's end. And so he says to himself, bread and wine. Let's begin there. This is my body. Now, what the church did with that bread and wine, imaginal practice, which is exactly what we're talking about. He's using his imagination. He's gathering a group of people to participate in that imagination. And he's saying very carefully, remember this practice. Continue to repeat this practice, not this practice of bread and wine, but this practice of imagination. And continually repeat this practice of imagination. And as you do that, you will experience something other than what's going on right here. It will have an otherness. And that otherness is Christ, the Christ consciousness, right? What did we do with that as the church? Well, we loved it. It just turned us on infinitely, because probably we connected with it just enough that we got it. But what we did as the church is we said, okay, if we got it, then it's ours. We'll three-dimensionalize it, and then we'll create out of that three-dimensional thing, which is an echo of a reminder of a whisper of a deep imaginal practice. Now that three-dimensional thing becomes a doctrine. And then that doctrine becomes the most important thing that the church repeats over and over again, taking away all of the imaginal practice and codifying it inside a very, very stale, dry, kind of dusty set of ideas that become the entrance pattern for anybody to get somewhere else other than where they are. And the church has said over various times that the Eucharist is the path to heaven, or if you're not getting the body of Christ, you're not getting divine presence, which is exactly the opposite of what Jesus was saying, and the opposite of what the practice was intended to do, which is to say, it's right here. It's right here. Right? That's one of the most powerful things for us to remind ourselves, is that all of these traditions have depth and imaginal practice in the midst of them. And you probably have in your own family system these very codified doctrinal things that began as imaginal practices where you manifested something that was other. And you codified them and you say, this is how it works. For instance, how does everybody do Thanksgiving? And what are you trying to recreate when you do Thanksgiving? Most of us, whether we know it or not, are trying to recreate something that was an imaginal experience that we had because we were all collectively in this space. Whether it's your grandparents' house or your parents' house or the time that you did that 10 years ago where it was just perfect, we got to do that again. And what we're doing is three-dimensionalizing and codifying it. That's what we do when we make doctrine. And we make doctrinal things all the time as human beings. And what Don's inviting us into, and I think with this, what really, I would tell you that what mystical Christianity and all the mystical traditions are getting us into is to say, yes, that's what we do, and keep participating in that imaginal practice. Keep participating in that expansiveness. So maybe when you take Eucharist next, if you do, that's your practice, maybe enter into, with a contemplative practice, however you can, that imaginal space where it might be all the way there. The church actually has a word for this. It's called anamnesis. That's what the Eucharist is that we're participating in a memory that isn't only a memory, a repetition. It's kind of a time-traveling kind of memory where we gather ourselves into that place as though we are there. So the church has the words for it, but we don't practice it very well. So I would invite you, whenever you want to do that. And then here's the crazy thing. Sorry, I'm going to keep going. Here's the crazy thing, is that the doctrine of that, or the idea of that, Jesus never codified that into a liturgical practice. He said, whenever you do this, do this. So that means every meal. Every time you sit at Whataburger. I'm not kidding. Every time you celebrate the miracle of nourishment, every time you participate in that, what is your body doing with that stuff you're putting in it? It's miraculous. Participate in that imaginal space. And then every place you have a meal is a sacred table. And you are the celebrant. And you are the people receiving the whole time. That's the whole thing.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that. We talked before about this beautiful image of feeding the angel.
Yeah.
And so, I've talked, I guess, in the first class about on each breath that we take in, we're taking in prana, life energy from space. So we could say with each breath, we're being fed. And what do we do each time we exhale? We're feeding all of existence. We're feeding as well the divine manifest in all of existence and in the subtle realms by the way that we've enhanced the light that has come through us. So every breath is a sacrament. Every breath is the Eucharist. Hazrat Khan said this most beautiful thing that there is but one sacred scripture, and the leaves of the trees are the pages of that scripture. And what did he mean by that? I say it in a little bit different way, that everything is a portal to the sacred. Everything, no exceptions. It all has to do with our way of relating to that. The way that our light interplays with the light that is coming in that now opens up possibilities that were not there before. So our whole life can become a living expression of sacredness. And what does it take? A little shift in our just way of relating to it. And yes, it takes quite a while to be able to sustain this, but it doesn't take very long at all to test this out in little bits. So I encourage you to go for a walk, and at least for part of your walk, mindfully notice something around you. Notice a tree, and really appreciate that tree and feel the tree's response to your appreciation of that tree, and feel what takes place in the relationship with you and the tree. The same thing with a bird singing, the moon up in the sky, just these little tiny things. You just take a moment, and that little pause and that little shift will bring us into, we think it's this altered state of consciousness, we think it's a mystical state of consciousness, we think it's a higher state of consciousness, but I would say no, we're shifting into a real state of consciousness, out of a state of consciousness that takes so much energy to maintain the illusion of isolation and separateness. Right. We can do this. You don't have to believe in anything. You don't have to have a religious belief necessarily. It helps to have some belief. So let me give you a little user's guide for how to use your imagination, some simple steps. Well, first of all, you need to have a desire for what you want to have happen. So it could be, these guys are talking about some pretty weird stuff up there, but maybe I'll give it a try and see if there's some validity to this. I'd like to try that. It sounds pretty good. You have to have an intention, a starting point. And then you have to have a willingness to let go of your usual state of experience and expectations, and not collapsing things back down into your concepts about it. So what Jonathan I think you were talking about what's happened in Christianity and certainly in other religions to rituals that are very beautiful. When people have a wonderful experience, of course they want to repeat that state, but often what they're trying to do is repeat a historical experience, which is not what's living right now. What's living right now may be something very different than what happened before, and if we keep trying to put it in the box of what was there before, we're cutting it off in the past from taking place. And then we need to have what I call a scaffolding or a bridge between our usual state of understanding and what's taking place. And what does this mean? Well, we have to have an image, like there was an image that went with this little practice of connecting the angelic realm with the physical realm, the different kinds of light. It could be Pir Vilayat, who was Diana, my teacher in the Sufis for many, many years, would work with different landscapes of the soul, like there's a landscape of the Holy Spirit being at the top of a mountain above the tree line, and the snow is just starting to melt, and it's the beginning of a stream, and that stream is the waters of life, and it's dark at night, and there's just it's just beautiful. Just imagining this takes you into a different space. So having a metaphor, having an image, working with a practice that's different from, that's why it's often helpful to have an object of meditation in a word that's from a different religion, because it doesn't have the same connotations, it just has the effect of the vibrations of it. And then just opening up with a sense of curiosity to what might come from that. That's all you need, those simple little steps, and try it. You'll be very surprised by what might come to you.
I think so then I would add to that, and by the way, we are going to have some time for questions in about 10 minutes or 8 minutes. Is it time for some of the cautions that we talked about?
Sure.
This is what we can do, and it's also worth suggesting as well to remind ourselves that as we get to those places, to remember that the practices might be compared to training wheels or to the bumpers in the bowling alley. That those practices are wonderful, but they're not the thing. They're not the thing. And remind yourself that our human tendency, again, is when we land in a space where we connect with something powerful, we grab the practice that got us there, we three-dimensionalize it. By that I'm meaning saying we have a two-dimensional thing, we make it three-dimensional, so we say this is the thing, forgetting that what we're really talking about is a multi-dimensional quantum experience. But the three-dimensional is the easiest for us to perceive and understand. So we place it in a book and we say, if we want to have a transcendent experience, we go to church, we have a Eucharist, we take some bread and some wine, we pray, we get quiet, and everything's amazing. Except everybody goes to church and has a Eucharist and it's not amazing. It's just that sometimes. Well, that's because it's a practice. It's not always going to be amazing. As we practice it, something might happen. If not, maybe not. Maybe it's time for a new practice. So, and remember also that another one, the way to say it is that the practices are, like I said, are not the point. And remember also that this path is not about you. And there's the phrase one spiritual director gave me is that this is not all about you, except that it's really all about you. That there's like we said with the receptors, there's a vastness that we're entering into. And remind yourself that part of my job is to get out of my own way and to not make myself the center of my life, to make this openness, the invitation for me to walk into. And the barrier for me to get to that space is often my barrier. It's often my stuff. So the phrase we might say, or that I find myself saying when people come to me and say, I'm not getting nourished in this church, what I often say is, that wasn't my intent. It's not my intent to make sure that you're spiritually nourished. I can't do that. That's your job. I can't be the one that makes that happen. We can be together a community that creates an openness where you might do your work, and at the same time, it's still your work. I've lost a lot of church members that way. And some of you who are here might know that. But I think that's the most honest thing we can say, Because I think we overpromise, thinking that we're in sales, rather than remembering that we're not in the business of sales. We're really in the business of becoming whole human beings.
My humorous self can't resist this. So, what Jonathan's talking about with the church and the individual is like the church is IKEA, and some assembly is required. Well, assembly, yes, gathering together, but assembly, you have to do the work of getting yourself out of the simulation that you've been in, so you can open to how you contribute to your unique way of participating in the collective experience. The Sufis would say of divinity awakening in life. And you can't ever get there, in quotes, if you think it's you in isolation that's doing this. It's you in relationship that's contributing to this. There's a huge difference between that. If we can begin to try to experience our lives always trying to be in a state of relationship with whatever we're experiencing, and not pulled back and separated out into concepts, projections, thinking that we can just rake it in and acquire more